Here's what nobody tells you about American gardening. You're doing it backwards. You plant monocultures because that's what every seed packet shows. You pull weeds and haul them to compost bins. You buy fertilizers to replace fertility you threw away. And you're trapped in the cycle that costs $500 yearly while producing mediocre yields that barely justify the effort. Meanwhile, Japanese farmers are producing twice the food per square foot, spending $20 on seeds, and working 30 hours per season instead of your 100. This isn't about harder work or better genetics. It's about observation-based design versus intervention-based gardening. The first thing Japanese farmers understand that American gardeners completely miss is this. Your garden is designed to fail. You're planting monocultures in neat rows because that's what every seed packet, gardening book, and YouTube channel tells you to do. One type of plant per bed. Tomatoes here, peppers there, lettuce in that corner. And you think you're being organized, but what you've actually created is a high-maintenance disaster that requires your constant intervention just to survive. Meanwhile, Japanese farmers are planting polycultures, multiple species growing together in the same space, and those plants are doing the work you're currently doing with your wallet and your weekends. Think about it. When you plant a tomato by itself, you're creating a pest buffet. Every hornworm, aphid, and whitefly in your neighborhood can see that tomato from across the yard. You're broadcasting a single-crop advertisement, and because that tomato is alone, it needs you to water it, feed it, stake it, and protect it from everything that wants to eat it before you do. Which means you're spending 2 hours every weekend managing one plant. But here's what traditional Japanese gardens do instead. They plant tomatoes with basil and marigolds in the same bed. Not because it looks nice, but because those three plants solve problems for each other through strategic relationships. The basil releases compounds that confuse the hornworms and improve the tomato's flavor, which means you're not spraying pesticides. The marigolds repel aphids and whiteflies while attracting beneficial insects that eat the pests you don't want, which means you're not buying expensive predator bugs or organic sprays. And all three plants have different root depths, which means they're not competing for the same nutrients and water in the soil, which means you're watering less and feeding less while your harvest increases. This is the foundation of the 2 times productivity gap. Not genetics, not climate, not some secret Japanese growing technique you need special equipment for. It's simply understanding that monocultures create dependency and polycultures create self-regulation. Here's what most people miss about companion planting. You think it's some new age gardening mysticism with no real evidence. But here's the reality. Japanese farmers have been testing these combinations for centuries through direct observation, and the mechanisms are simple plant chemistry and ecology. The second method Japanese farmers use is what they call the 3 sisters. And if you've never heard of this, it's going to change how you think about every vegetable you plant. Corn, beans, and squash planted together in the same mound. The corn grows tall and provides a natural trellis for the beans to climb, which means you're not buying and installing stakes or cages that cost $15 each. The beans are nitrogen-fixing legumes, which means they're pulling nitrogen from the air through bacteria in their roots and feeding it to the corn and squash, which means you're not buying fertilizer at $30 per bag. And the squash spreads across the ground with big prickly leaves that shade out weeds and keep the soil moist, which means you're not weeding every weekend or watering daily. 3 plants, 1 space, 0 inputs, triple the harvest compared to planting each one separately. Think about the economics. You're spending $45 on stakes, fertilizer, and mulch for 3 separate beds. They're spending $3 on seeds for 1 polyculture mound that outproduces all 3 of your beds combined. But here's where it gets interesting, because this same principle works with dozens of other combinations you can start using this weekend. Cucumbers with radishes and nasturtiums. The radishes break up compacted soil and germinate fast, marking the rows before the cucumbers even sprout, which means you're not guessing where you planted. The nasturtiums climb the cucumber trellis and repel cucumber beetles while attracting pollinators, which means better fruit set and 0 pest damage. Lettuce with carrots and onions. The lettuce shades the soil and keeps it cool for the carrots, which means they don't bolt in hot weather and turn bitter. The onions repel carrot rust flies and aphids, which means your carrots grow clean without spraying. Cabbage with thyme and chamomile. The herbs confuse cabbage moths and improve the flavor of the cabbage, while providing habitat for parasitic wasps that kill cabbage worms before they become a problem, which means you're preventing pest issues through design instead of fighting them with intervention. And every single one of these combinations reduces your workload while increasing your yield, because the plants are managing pests, building fertility, and regulating moisture for each other instead of you doing it with products and labor. This might shock you, but your local garden center doesn't want you to know this, because self-regulating polycultures don't need the fertilizers, pesticides, and amendments they're selling. You're spending $40 to $60 per season on inputs for a single tomato plant that produces maybe 15 pounds of fruit if you're lucky. Japanese farmers are spending $3 on seeds for a polyculture bed that produces 50 pounds of multiple vegetables with less work, which means they're saving hundreds of dollars yearly while you're spending hundreds. The math isn't even close. And this is why the productivity gap exists. You're gardening inside a system designed to keep you buying solutions to problems your design created in the first place. They're gardening inside a system designed to eliminate those problems before they appear, which means your garden needs you every single day, and their gardens need them 10 minutes per week for harvesting. Here's why these first methods matter more than you think. They're not just tips for growing better tomatoes or saving a few dollars. They're proof that the entire framework of modern American gardening is backwards. We've been taught to fight nature, to control it, to dominate it with chemicals and constant intervention. Japanese farmers learned centuries ago that observation beats intervention every single time. And the difference in results speaks for itself. But here's the reality most gardeners never learn. The question isn't whether polycultures and companion planting work, because the evidence is overwhelming. The question is how much longer you're going to keep gardening the expensive, exhausting way. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the methods you just learned are surface level compared to what Japanese farmers actually do with soil and weeds. This next approach might shock you. While you're spending hours every week pulling weeds and hauling them to a compost bin in the corner of your yard, Japanese farmers are deliberately planting what you'd call weeds and never removing them. They're using living mulch. And before you think this is some kind of permaculture fantasy that doesn't work in real gardens, understand that this is how traditional Satoyama farming has maintained soil fertility for centuries without buying a single bag of fertilizer. Here's how it works. You plant low-growing, nitrogen-fixing ground covers like white clover, creeping thyme, or vetch between your main crops. These plants stay short, spread across bare soil, and do four things simultaneously. First, they shade the ground, which keeps soil temperatures 15 to 20 degrees cooler in summer, which means your plants aren't stressed and your water isn't evaporating as fast. Second, they outcompete the actual weeds you don't want, which means you're not weeding. Third, they're constantly fixing nitrogen from the air and feeding it to your vegetables through their root systems, which means you're not fertilizing. And fourth, when you cut them back or pull small sections, that green material becomes instant mulch that breaks down in place and builds soil organic matter, which means you're composting without bins, turning, or waiting. Think about what you're doing right now. You're buying bags of mulch at $8 each and spreading them around your plants every spring. Or you're pulling weeds, walking them to a compost pile, turning that pile for months, then hauling finished compost back to your beds. You're doing the same job 3 times, which means you're wasting hours you could spend doing literally anything else. Japanese farmers plant clover once, mow it occasionally with scissors when it gets too tall, and let it fall where it lands. 0 inputs, 0 hauling, continuous fertility building. The time difference alone is worth understanding. You're spending 2 hours every weekend managing weeds and fertility. They're spending 10 minutes per month giving the living mulch a haircut, which means they're getting 90% of their weekends back while you're still out there bending over, pulling the same weeds that came back from last week. But here's what most people miss about living mulch. It's not just about saving time and money. It's about creating a self-regulating ground layer that makes everything else easier. Your soil stays consistently moist because it's always covered, which means you're watering 70% less. The soil structure improves because those plant roots are constantly dying and regrowing, creating channels for air and water, while feeding soil biology, which means your vegetables grow faster with less effort. And beneficial insects like ground beetles and predatory mites live in that ground cover year-round, which means they're already present when pests show up on your vegetables, controlling problems before you even notice them. This is integrated pest management through design, not through spraying organic pesticides every week and pretending that's sustainable. Now let's talk about what Japanese farmers do with plant waste, because this is where Western gardening really fails. You're cutting back tomato plants in fall, pulling spent lettuce, trimming herbs, and putting all of that material in a compost bin, or worse, in yard waste bags for the city to haul away. You're exporting fertility. And then next spring, you're buying compost and fertilizer to replace the fertility you threw away, which means you're paying twice for the same nutrients. Japanese farmers practice chop and drop composting, which means plant material gets cut and left exactly where it grew. When a lettuce plant bolts, they cut it at ground level and let it fall. When beans finish producing, they cut the stems and leave them. When they trim tomato suckers or pruning branches, those go right back on the soil surface around the plant. And all of that material breaks down in place over weeks or months, feeding the soil biology directly while protecting the surface from sun and erosion, which means they're building fertility through the same action that clears spent plants. Think about it. The difference in soil quality is measurable. American gardens that export their plant waste see soil organic matter stay flat at 2 to 3% year after year. Japanese gardens using chop and drop see organic matter climb to 8 to 12% over a decade, which means their soil holds more water, more nutrients, and supports more beneficial organisms without any imported inputs. Your soil is dying slowly while theirs is building itself into black gold. And the work comparison is absurd. You're bending over, pulling plants, carrying them somewhere, managing a compost system, then hauling finished compost back. They're making one cut and walking away. Same result in the soil, 90% less labor, which means they're spending their time harvesting instead of maintaining. But here's the reality most people never understand about these methods. They're not separate tricks you add to your existing garden. They work together as a system. The living mulch feeds the chop and drop material. The chop and drop builds soil that grows better living mulch. The companion polycultures above ground benefit from the soil improvements below ground, and everything reinforces everything else, which means the garden gets easier and more productive every season, instead of staying stuck in the same maintenance cycle you're trapped in right now. And this is where Japanese farming separates serious growers from weekend hobbyists. Because anyone can plant a tomato and water it all summer. But building a self-improving system that requires less work every year while producing more food takes a different mindset entirely. It takes understanding that your garden is an ecosystem, not a collection of individual plants that each need your constant attention, which means you stop thinking like a maintenance worker and start thinking like an ecosystem designer. Here's what most people miss. The methods you're learning aren't about working harder or being a better gardener. They're about being a smarter designer who eliminates problems through relationships instead of fighting them with products and labor. Japanese farmers learn this through centuries of observation. You can learn it this weekend by planting your first living mulch, or leaving your next pruning where it falls instead of hauling it away, which means you can start the transition immediately, without buying anything or building anything new. The critical insight most gardeners miss is this. Every intervention you make creates dependency, and every relationship you design creates independence. Japanese farmers understand that the goal isn't to grow better tomatoes this season. The goal is to build a system that grows better tomatoes every season with less work. And that system starts with perennials and seed saving. Think about your current garden. Everything in it is annual. You plant seeds or transplants every spring, harvest in summer or fall, then rip it all out and start over next year. Which means you're buying seeds, buying transplants, preparing beds, planting, and doing the entire setup process from scratch annually. Japanese farmers plant perennials once and harvest for decades. Asparagus produces for 25 years, rhubarb for 30. Perennial herbs like thyme, oregano, and sage give you harvests year after year, while also attracting pollinators and beneficial insects. Fruit trees and berry bushes produce for 15 to 40 years depending on variety, and once established, these plants require almost no maintenance compared to annuals because their root systems are massive, drought-resistant, and capable of mining nutrients from deep in the subsoil that shallow annual roots never reach, which means they're feeding themselves from resources you can't access with annual vegetables. Here's what most people miss. The work difference is profound. Year 1, you plant an asparagus crown and wait. Year 2, light harvest. Year 3 and beyond, you're cutting fresh spears every spring for 2 months straight with zero replanting, zero fertilizing, just occasional weeding, which means you're harvesting instead of constantly restarting. Compare that to annual vegetables, where you're starting from bare dirt every single season, which means you're always working instead of always harvesting. But here's the reality. Perennials aren't just productive for you. They're building soil, creating habitat, and establishing microclimates that make everything around them easier to grow. A mature fruit tree casts shade that lets you grow lettuce and spinach through summer heat that would normally bolt them in 3 days. Its deep roots break up compacted subsoil and create channels that drain water away from soggy areas while storing it for drought. Its canopy moderates temperature swings, protecting tender plants from late spring frosts and early fall freezes. And its fallen leaves provide free mulch and slow-release fertility every autumn, which means you're not buying mulch or fertilizer. You're not just growing fruit. You're engineering a more resilient growing environment that reduces your workload across the entire garden. Now let's talk about seed saving, because this is where Japanese farmers achieve true independence from the system that's currently extracting money from you every spring. You're buying seeds every year, hybrid varieties that won't breed true, which means you can't save seeds even if you wanted to. And those seed packets cost $3 to $6 each, which adds up to $60 to $100 per season for a modest garden. Think about it. Japanese farmers save seeds from open-pollinated varieties that have been adapted to their specific microclimates over generations, which means their seeds are free, perfectly adapted to local conditions, and get better every year as they naturally select for the strongest plants. The process is simple for most crops. Let your best lettuce plant bolt and go to seed. Collect the seeds when dry. Plant them next spring, which means zero cost. Let your healthiest tomato over-ripen on the vine. Scoop out the seeds, ferment them for 3 days, rinse, dry, and store. Next season, those seeds produce tomatoes already adapted to your soil, your weather, your pest pressure, which means better performance than anything you could buy. But here's what most people miss about seed saving. You're breaking the dependency cycle. You're not sending money to seed companies every spring. You're not locked into whatever varieties they decide to sell. You're not vulnerable to supply chain disruptions or price increases. You have complete control over your food production from soil to seed to harvest to next season's planting, which means real food security. And this is the kind of independence that actually matters. Not having 3 months of canned goods in your basement, but having the knowledge and the genetics to grow food indefinitely without external inputs. This is what Japanese Satoyama farmers maintained through centuries of isolation. Complete regional food independence through saved seeds and perennial systems. Now here's how this works in modern constraints, because you're probably thinking this sounds great for someone with 5 acres in rural Japan, but impossible in your suburban quarter-acre lot or your HOA-restricted condo balcony. This might shock you, but Japanese farmers prove otherwise. Container polycultures work on balconies. A single large container can hold tomatoes, basil, marigolds, and trailing nasturtiums, creating the same companion benefits as a full garden bed, which means you can do this anywhere. Living mulch works in small raised beds. White clover between vegetables in a 4x8 bed provides the same nitrogen-fixing and weed-suppressing benefits as it does in a quarter-acre plot. Perennials scale down. Dwarf fruit trees in containers, herbs in window boxes, asparagus in a narrow side yard bed, which means you don't need land to build permanent food production. And seed saving works with a single plant. You don't need 50 tomato plants to save seeds. You need one healthy plant that you let go to full maturity. So here's the question. Why are you still gardening the hard way? Why are you spending weekends fighting weeds, buying fertilizers, replacing the same annual vegetables every spring, and getting mediocre yields that barely justify the effort? Japanese farmers prove daily that there's a better path. Design relationships instead of managing interventions. Build soil instead of buying amendments. Plant perennials instead of replanting annuals. Save seeds instead of buying packets. And create systems that become more productive and less demanding with time instead of staying locked in endless maintenance. Which means your garden gives time back instead of consuming it. This isn't about being Japanese. This isn't about traditional farming nostalgia. This is about observation-based design that works because it aligns with how ecosystems actually function instead of fighting them. Start this weekend. Plant one companion trio in your existing garden. Add white clover between your vegetables. Let one tomato go to seed. Leave your pruning on the ground instead of composting it. Watch what happens when you stop gardening backwards. The 2 times productivity gap closes the moment you stop treating your garden like a battlefield and start treating it like an ecosystem. You're not fighting nature, you're designing with it. You're not a better gardener, you're a smarter designer.